And then, yeah,
Okay.
everybody turn your video off and mute.
Okay, so really quickly, I was addressing Tony's email question about the frog DNA component in our curriculum. And it turns out there's not that much. I thought about this quite a bit, actually. And the main reason is because when I started doing this, I really started from the ground up from the source text. I had a little bit of fencing experience from college. It wasn't extensive, it was just enough so I knew what to do with a sword. The more I pursued this, the more I basically started looking at what I had on the text and the pictures, especially once I got a hold of Fabris, where the pictures are very accurate and detailed. And everything that I started doing involved trying to make things work so that they looked exactly like the pictures. So I really didn't have to make a lot of assumptions, or rather, I didn't have to go fishing elsewhere for them. Like I started saying, if there was any place where there were beginning assumptions, it was in footwork, because most of the texts don't really talk about footwork that much. You have to really go fishing for it. And so we started with, what is the basic footwork of modern fencing, which is the advancing step, which is very historical, but we had to make sure we had to go look for the actual sources that told you it was historical. Turns out there's a late 16th century master called Paternoster from Rome, who actually gives you 4 types of stepping with a rapier, and that's one of them. Thank Fabris for the fact that he's very explicit about what he's doing, and where he's not explicit, the pictures are. If anything, I've worked backwards. Rather than fishing in modern systems to plug the gaps in the text I study, I've gone looking at the 16th century, where there are more clues, and from which the Italian rapier systems derive, basically. Essentially, the more I worked with Rob and studied the Bolognese system, the more I was able to inform the Rapier curriculum, and the more I was able to plug in some gaps. That process has been going on for 5 or 6 years now. So Tony, in answer to your question, we're actually I feel on pretty solid ground historically with everything that we're doing. Yeah, that's about it. Okay.
Those gaps that you were filling up, where were they primarily aside from footwork?
Okay, Perry's is one. Fabris, most of the rapier masters, but especially Fabris, don't really talk about parries because they don't like them. What Fabris will tell you is that you should parry and strike in one motion, in one tempo. How that works practically, we have to go looking elsewhere. Now, there are modern parries. There are parries from older systems where they operated more in 2 tempi, parry, risposta. And then it was a matter of figuring out how blades interact with each other. I had some clues from other teachers pursuing this, and I picked some brains. But that was one where I had to go looking elsewhere. But again, not so much in modern sources, and not in sources that were unrelated. I feel pretty confident that anything that we borrow from the earlier cut and thrust systems of the 16th century, as in the Bolognese school, is directly applicable to what we do. So footwork, parries, yeah, nothing springs to mind off the top of my head. I'm sure there are other things. Certain body mechanics. Again, looking at Fabrus's illustrations, I see where we're ending up from point A to point B. He doesn't describe how you get there exactly, but then it's simply a matter of looking at the earlier body mechanics, and by earlier, we're talking about 20, 30, 40 years earlier, and then applying it to the system that developed, which was a very linear system. So I like to say that early 17th century Italian rapier is basically what the Bolognese were doing in the 16th century, except that you take it from there and you put it there, and you take all these big circular motions and put them in a little tunnel. So yeah, so there's an example, and if something else occurs to me in the next hour, I'll let you know. Anything else? Anybody else?
John, did you get my email about my question?
Yeah, toe heel, heel toe. Good one. I hate it. Mostly because what's that?
I try.
Yeah. No, I mean, I love it because I hate it. There is no agreement on how we're stepping. There are pros and cons to both ways. If we're looking at I think we have a predilection towards heel toe, mostly because of modern footwear, where we don't have the worry of skidding across the floor when our heel hits the floor. It's also a very natural way, and sorry, I had to move into a smaller room to reconnect, so I don't have as much space to physically demonstrate. But when we step in guard, we tend to, even as we're pushing ourselves forward from our back foot, we tend to kick out a little bit from our front knee. That lifts our foot off the ground, and the first thing that's going to hit the ground is going to be the heel, unless we are actually reaching for the floor with our toe. Now, that's a fairly unnatural thing to do. So I don't look for that. What I try to tell people to try and make contact with the floor with their entire soul. Now, this is particularly, I feel, important with the lunge. If you are lunging and going toe first, then you're basically going to land on the ball of your foot and not really make contact with your heel. You're going to land on the ball of that foot, and your knee's going to keep going so that you stay on the ball of the foot. You don't want that. That's stressing out a lot of joints, and it's not creating a lot of stability. On the other hand, if you are reaching for the floor with your heel with the lunge in a period shoe, you might just skid across the floor. You're also, slamming your heel into the floor, and I'm here to tell you that plantar fasciitis is not a very pleasant thing. Every illustration that we see of a lunge really shows a nice foot flat on the ground. There are exceptions in the mid 17th century with some small sword manuals where you see people completely overextending their lunge, in my opinion, over their toe. We're not going to go there. But I think it's a fair thing to think of in the lunge to, again, just lift your foot off the floor and just land it. Now, when we step, we are trying to do it as naturally as possible. Most people here know that I have been trying to get you to step with your weight very low to the ground, very grounded, and pushing off from whichever is the non-leading foot. So pushing off from the back foot going forward and vice versa. Even as you're pushing, like I said, your lower front leg is going to swing forward. The heel will reach the ground first. Now, the danger there is you swing that lower leg out and the leg locks in a straight line and the heel hits the floor, and then you're simply slowing down the completion of the step. So you need to lift that heel, but not emphasize the heel, if that makes sense. You're looking to land the entire foot on the ground as quickly as possible, but if it's going to be, it's not going to be heel toe. It's going to be leading with the heel and bang, like that. I would say when you are lunging, try not to lead with anything. Just push that foot forward and let it land. When you're stepping, keep it natural, but don't hang out on your heel. Does that answer your question?
More, yeah, pretty much. Although, just because we actually worked on this in the private lessons, and we kind of mulling about and practicing. But going back to that, can I rephrase sort of a different thing for clarification's sake? So what you've been saying is like, so you said there's like the reaching out is a natural, but the way just to reiterate to see if I can doing this, like, because the way I've been doing it, which is led to a lot of the issues of locked front knee and the fact that like uncontrolled step, is to keep the weight on the back foot like at all times. So the initially step is just launch back foot and then let follow behind, as opposed to I think what we tried doing before, which is, as you just said, is kind of an unnatural practice, not necessarily heel toe, but to stretch out and then shift. Well, I don't know if it's necessary to shift the weight to the forward foot, but then be able to have a control, basically change the balance from the back leg to the front leg until you can place it wherever, here, or usually a grip right there.
Yeah, that's going to depend on how far you're stepping, right? If you're taking a nice small step, you barely have to shift anything onto the front foot in order to scoot your back foot forward. If it's a nice big step, as for instance, this step that we've been taking into the narrow measure, then obviously there's going to be a little bit more of a weight shift forward. In which case, you don't want to make that motion clunkier or longer by laying your heel on the ground, then putting your toe down, then shifting your weight, then bringing your back foot forward. See what I mean?
Yeah.
So if you are taking that huge step, you want to get your foot on the ground, right? Complete foot on the ground. Whether or not it started from the heel, you want to get to here. Not so much that as that. All right, like a nice 3-point landing. Right, coming in ass first, land, shift, and bring the back foot forward. That make sense?
Yeah, I need more clarification. We'll just take off later, but I think that should be enough for now.
Okay, cool. Okay, who's next?
On a related note, the rear foot, when you're lunging, I heard someone saying that they tend to channel their lunge or drive with their heel more than with the ball of their foot. Ever after that, I kind of examined my stance and I noticed that I tend to push more with the ball of my rear foot. Is there a compelling reason why I should switch or why one is preferable over the other?
Sorry, who's talking?
This is Eric.
Oh, Eric, hi. Okay, so, well, you were operating from a Faber stance, where the center of your center of mass is more over your back foot than it would be in a Capo-Ferro stance. I don't see a problem with it. I don't see it as being necessary. It may have to do with how you're settling your weight on your foot to begin with. In fact, I think we actually talked about this once before, and I forget how that conversation went, but it sounds familiar. In the stance that you're using, the foot is not as turned back as it is in the Capo-Ferro stance. It's a little bit more towards 9 o'clock, if not sometimes past it to 10 o'clock. So there it would make perfect sense for you to push off the ball of your foot. If in the Capo-Ferro stance or the common stance where your foot is more at 7 or 8 o'clock, the direction of force is more in line with the entire sole. So there will be more of a push from the entire sole. Whereas if the more lateral the foot is, more laterally it is directed, the more it will tend to come from the ball, as far as I can tell.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Okay. Anything else? And guys, feel free to type questions as they come to you in the chat. Okay, so let me, if nobody else has got anything right now, I can address one of Dan's questions, who is not here today, I believe, but we'll get the recording. He was asking about Italian versus Spanish, the advantages and disadvantages of one versus the other. First off, it's my credo in many ways that the value of any combat system is in how it performs against any other combat system. If it can only fight itself, what's the point? Next, every system is going to have advantages and disadvantages, obviously. But the main advantage will be to the person who knows how to use their system better. A really good diestro against a really good Italian fencer should be fairly well matched, because they both understand the strengths and weaknesses of their own system. I know this wasn't actually Dan's question, but the point being is that the systems are not superior or inferior to one another. Advantages and disadvantages. Well, if you understand your own, well, let's look at the guards, for instance. If you, yeah, Shannon, what's up?
I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. I thought you'd just ask me when you had some time, but I was just wondering if you'd tried or had experience with any of the German Rapier Meyer stuff, and if you did, what you thought of it, pros, cons, that kind of thing as well.
Okay, so. I'll get to that. I'll get to that next.
Great.
No, Sid, I do not have an anti-puck flow chart. I know he has an anti-John flow chart. Just found that out last year, but that was for a specific occasion. If you just look at the guards, the Spanish distressa system is much more erect with the sword arm extended out at pretty much at 90 degrees from the body. So what do we know about guards? He is extending the sword towards you, so so he is keeping you at a distance, just like we are doing. He's also exposing the weak of his sword, just like we are doing. He is uncovering, from the Italian perspective, he's uncovering more of his body. His body is not hidden behind his sword, not if he's holding his sword up at shoulder height. But that does not mean he's not guarded. It just means that he's got more of a target than you do. The rest is knowing how to get there. Both systems tend to approach the other person's weapon the same way. We try to find the sword without touching it. They, from my understanding, they do not have the same compunction about not touching your opponent's blade. What they call the atajo is basically just finding the sword, but often with contact. And if someone is trying to make contact with your sword or actually use their blade to control yours, what do we as Italians do? We avoid their blade. So you could say that the Spanish predilection towards sword contact makes them, from an Italian perspective or from an Elmara perspective, a thug. Just the same way that I teach you guys to deal with with fencing someone with a long sword or fencing somebody who has an arming sword. If you stick their sword out at them, they've got to deal with it. Now, that's not necessarily the only thing that a diestro will do, but it's, again, more of a predilection for them than it is for the Italian. On the other hand, the Italian tends to expose himself or commit himself a lot more in the attack than the Spaniard does. The Spaniards don't lunge per se. The Italians will perform a huge commitment in a linear fashion from which they have to recover. And the Spaniard can exploit that. One of the most annoying things about fencing a Spaniard is they really like to cut. And a cut during the recovery from your lunge can be pretty effective. I had that happen to me several times in my 2011 bout with Puck at WMAW. On the other hand, if I see it coming, I have ideas of how to counter it. Again, it's knowing what your opponent is likely to do, what his predilections are, and being able to pick the correct tool out of your toolkit to deal with it. So the more you understand your system and the more you understand his system, the better off you are fencing it. So yeah, you want to look at your opponent's, what your opponent does and how he stands and how he holds his weapon, and just think of it in terms of, well, if an Italian were holding himself like that, how would I approach him? What are the weaknesses that I know, or the strengths that I know about in that guard? And simply deal with it that way. Okay. Oh, good. More Italian versus Spanish. Distress, I was going to leave. Yeah. The difference being, okay, so question is that the Stresa became gradually refined over the 17th century, and did the Fabris and or Capoferro system get expanded upon? Well, yeah. Especially a lot of the texts we have that expand on the Fabrician system are German. As Greg intimated on Friday, Fabris basically took over German fencing after he died. A lot of his pupils were German. He taught in Germany for quite a while, and a lot of the pupils that published books based on his system were of the Germanic people. Now there's a lot of there's more research I want to do on how his system expanded into the German countries, but yeah, that it definitely got pursued. Now there's a big difference because the sword changed, or rather, it changed quite a bit in the Italian style practitioners. Not quite so much with the Spanish style practitioners. Now, the Destreza, much like Italian rapier, got its starts with the cut and thrust sword of the 17th century. The Spanish took to the long rapier, just like the Italians did, but the Spanish seem to have hung on to it longer, well into the 18th century, so that you have a small sword text of the mid 18th century, Domenico Angelo, who shows you how you should fence with your small sword against a Spaniard who has a big ass long sword. So while the Spanish were refining their system for the rapier, the Italians and the people who were continuing the Italian system were refining it, but with a gradually more and more different weapon. The weapon got lighter, it got shorter, it got faster, so that a lot of the single tempo actions that we see in the early 17th century became two tempi actions because they could, because their weapon was fast enough to do it, until you finally get to the small sword, which is just a little Maserati of a weapon that you just can't catch. So that's what happened to the Italian system. It got refined, but with a different, lighter, smaller, faster weapon.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? By the way, if you want to see, Rob's on here. If you want to talk to somebody about the German descendants of Fabris, talk to Rob. He's been doing a lot of reading on the 17th century texts. In fact, I think he'll be telling you quite a bit about tomorrow in his painting presentation. Oh yeah, Meyer. So I have fenced a little bit. I fenced James Riley at last WMAW. He specifically wanted to fence his side sword versus my rapier. It's a cut and thrust sword, and a Italian rapierist has ways of dealing with a cut and thrust sword. It came down to how quickly I could respond to his cuts. I don't have a lot of practice, as much practice as I would like, countering cuts. So that's usually how he would beam me. But the times I was able to, again, take a tempo, keep my point free, it just worked the same way. I don't have any particular feelings about the Meyer system and fencing the Meyer system. I just tend to look at it as a another style of cut and thrust fencing. Rebecca. Huh. Yeah, the Three Musketeers. Yeah, that is pretty ironic because the Three Musketeers is how I came to this. I fell in love with the rapier because of the 1970s Musketeer films by Richard Lester with Michael York and Oliver Reed, etc. My absolute favorite movies growing up. And so when the Guild colors turned out to be green, I was very upset. I wanted to be Musketeer blue. Indeed, he does. Poor Alatriste. But his name says it all. We don't talk about French rapier fencing because there wasn't French rapier fencing. That doesn't mean they weren't fencing rapier. They just didn't have any. They didn't have a system. They were doing Italian. The closest thing we have to it is Saint-Didier from the last part of the 17th century. Sorry, 16th century. Very similar to the late Bolognese, Degrassi, for instance, and definitely a shorter cut and thrust sword. But between Saint-Didier and the proponents of the shorter, what we call the transitional rapier, rapier turning into a small sword in the past the mid 17th century. Between those two, we don't have any French. So I'm sure there were French fencing instructors. I don't know if that they brought any innovations to the art. We can't know, but we don't know them. But we can be pretty confident that if they were there, they were influenced by the Italians or by the Spanish, because those were the two powerhouses in rapier in the early 17th century. Whose book? Oh, Saint-Didier. Didier, not Deirdre. D-I-D-I-E-R. Yeah, and it's very much just a cut and paste lesson book. Every technique is, basically the 3/4 is just the same text with a different ending. Interestingly enough, it's possibly the first reference we have to Fabris in Saint-Didier's book, possibly. In his prologue, in his introduction, he mentions meeting the Italian fencer Fabrice, or Fabris, F-A-B-R-I-C-E, who may or may not be our guy. That would have been in the 1580s, I think. And if he had met him, then Fabris was still, youngish and, not the full-fledged master that we know now. All right. Let's see, French students. Well, there's a lot to say about that, and it has to deal with dueling culture. So Vadim's comment is that French students came to Italy to learn from Italian masters, but were much more likely to end their fights in bloody death than the Italians were. Dueling culture was different in various places. It was it came and went in waves. Where it caught on, it really caught on. It became a fetish. The Italians were perhaps the masters of regulating it, and this may have been honored more on text than in deed. But Greg likes to say that the Italians would litigate their way out of a duel if they absolutely, unless they absolutely could not. They would find a way to use technicalities to get out of it. And when they did get out of it, they weren't quite as hot to kill each other. French were a different matter entirely. For the French, the dueling culture, think NASCAR, but with a lot of blood. For the French, the dueling was a craze. It was a way of life for some, and killing people were very much just notches on your belt. I'm overgeneralizing, but in comparison to the Italians, yeah, the French were a little nutso. And they were, for much of the later part of the 16th century into the early 17th, until Cardinal Richelieu finally put it down. From the Three Musketeers, we kind of get the idea that he wasn't too successful. Well, he was extremely successful, because Richelieu basically laid the groundwork for the absolute monarchy. And whenever the monarchy was at its most powerful, dueling petered off. When central authority got weaker, or there were popular rebellions, like during the Fronde, before Louis XIV's reign, whenever the monarchy didn't have as much of a handle of things, then dueling shot up again. But yeah, during what we call the Rapier period, the late 16th, early 17th, the French were absolutely insane. Okay. Oh, this should not be done in public. There are definitely people doing rigorously studying Fabris. Bill Grandy is one of them. Devin Borman, it's not his focus, but he certainly has studied it rigorously. We have our friends in Vienna, I forget the name of their group, but Florian and Carl, that you may have met at WMAW, who are quite serious about it and who have done a lot of very good work. They've done a lot of work with the texts, transcribing and translating in some cases. Then there are people, and I'm not going to mention names publicly, who have put stuff on YouTube that, frankly, I think that they're going to hurt themselves more than anything, just by the way they do things. And I wish them nothing but, an ignominious end. So yes, there are lots of people. There aren't that many people doing it here on this continent. There's also a group down in Texas that's fairly recent. I haven't seen much of their work. I think Rob maybe has seen more of it. And I suspect there are many more people in Europe doing it. The ones I have seen, what I think of it is very spotty. There are, you know, there are people whose videos I would tell you to absolutely stay away from, unless you want to get drunk and have a good laugh. Bill Grandy is extremely rigorous and extremely skilled, and I would recommend anybody hang out with him with a sword anytime. And you know, Devin obviously goes without saying. Don't know what the Texas boys are up to, so I'll leave it at that. Anybody else? Are there any questions that were posed online by email that I have not addressed? I don't think so.
I think the only thing I have is just the solo drills.
Oh yeah, solo drills. Okay. Yeah. By the way, we're going to go a little over to make up for the mishap. You know, if you have to leave, of course that's up to you. Okay, so. Pre-17th century, solo forms are very well documented, mostly because you're looking at a very large repertory of actions, and the idea was to practice how they all linked one into the other. And sorry, Rob, I'm overgeneralizing, of course, but I think that it distinguishes it from what we do, which has a much smaller repertoire of actions. Certainly the basic actions. So there aren't really any solo forms documented, and of course that caused a problem for us, especially right now. I intend to put some things together, a video. I've already got a few videos out that Alicia is going to be posting. They're mostly just ways of approaching some very basic technique and being able to practice it and check yourselves while you're doing it. But I will put out some more that actually string together some actions. I actually, once upon a time, tried to emulate Greg's Fiore dance with a Fabris dance. Didn't work quite as well, but I've got a little basis to work from. For the scholars, there is obviously a rapier and dagger solo form. The long-time scholars know it. The short-time scholars have not had a chance to learn it yet. And it involves a number of guards and actions that they have not learned yet, but I'll try and put out a truncated version of that for the actions that they have learned. Right now, you can certainly practice footwork, you can certainly practice guards and guard transitions with footwork. As I've said in the past to all my taster students, the most important thing you can have is a full-length mirror. Not just so you can check yourself while you're working, but also to give yourself an opponent. You know, you give yourself an actual target in the mirror, and you also give yourself a way of seeing what is visible to your opponent and what isn't. Basically, if you put yourself in the position of your own opponent, you can see, you can pretty much see what's wrong with your guard because you see what's showing and what's not, what's covered and what's not. If you perform actions slowly, like do a real slow Tai Chi lunge in any guard, and look at look at the progression of your action and what is covered at any given point and what isn't, that'll give you some ideas of how to tweak the timing of what you're doing. Now I'm giving you just some pointers. Obviously, I'll be giving you actual things to do, but that's where we're going from here. And I think that is probably the one question I needed the most is, you know, what you guys need and what you want. One thing that you can do right off the bat. And by the way, if you don't have a full-length mirror, give yourself a target. And again, you don't have to like do a cardboard cutout or anything. All you need is, you know, table. There's a book there. There's a book there. You're going to aim at that book, or you're going to aim at that book. And if you don't have room to use a sword, use something shorter, or use your finger. As long as you assume that your sword is following the line of your arm, in other words, assuming that that your sword and arm have an impeccable structure, then it's merely a matter of pointing your structure at a target and then another one. So, for instance, we've done a lot of work with the guard change of late. Let me see if I can do this here. So I'm looking at myself in the mirror. There's a shoulder, there's a shoulder. Yeah? So let's say I am pointing at that shoulder there. So I'm in a terza on the outside, and I want to go into a lunge of quarta. So I'm going to not expose my forearm. I'm going to turn from the hips until my finger is pointing at that shoulder and come back. Shoulder and come back. Shoulder and extend and come back. Shoulder, extend, and lunge and come back. And of course, you can do the exact same thing going from the inside to the outside. The idea, of course, is that you always want to be pointing where you're going before you go there. I do recommend, if you don't have room for a sword, I recommend having something in your hand, a yardstick, a ruler, a dagger, so that you can work on the alignment of the weapon with your forearm. And then later we'll do some things with cavazione and natural angles and such. All right. So tell you what, let's make that a little bit of homework. That little exercise, if you can record yourself doing this and you want to share it with people in the next class so that we can critique it and everybody can learn from it, go ahead and do that. All right, so here, right, go there. Here, go there, and follow through with the lunge. Okay. Something very, very simple. When Alicia posts the first videos that I put out, I'll send an email suggesting things you can do with that, and we'll look at that next time. In the meantime, give me some time, but I'll work out some actual solo forms that you can do with the 17th century rapier. Okay, looks like we're getting near the end. Anybody have any final questions? Oh, hi. Let's see what we got here. Yeah, well, Sid, that depends on how big your apartment is. Yes, learning to lunge slow would be good for slow fencing. It's also good for fast fencing because probably one of the most important ways to drill on your own is to do it as slowly as you can, but with as much control as you can, and learn how to speed it up very, very gradually. Right? If you do it nice and slow so you can see what you are doing, then then you gain a lot more control and perception of your actions. Do you have any thought? Oh, I heard about the bucklers. Yeah, Rob, I think that, frankly, I think that Fabris was more concerned with the weapon combinations that were much more likely to be used on the street. The most common ones, as you pointed out, he wanted to be brief, which is really ironic considering his book is twice the size of anybody else's. I also think that there may very well have been people fencing with bucklers at the time, but I think it was on its way out by then. Fabris, you know, like everybody else, he starts off by saying, you know, how wonderful it is to learn how to fence so you can defend your defend king and country. But really, let's face it. By that point, it was all about fighting duels, and he talks about fighting duels. And these are the weapon combinations: sword alone, sword and dagger, sword and cloak. That would be most that I'm pretty sure would be most used in duels at that time. If you ask me, I would also suggest that he found these combinations to be the most elegant. Possibly, just throwing it out there, you would have considered the buckler as a more clunkier throwback. Don't quote me on that. Okay, all right. Last call for questions. Okay, guys. Thank you very much for being here. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I'm sorry about the glitches.
I've got some comments before you totally wrap it up.
Sure.
Just for everybody else. So for those of you on Facebook, and I know everybody's not, so don't worry. For those of you on Facebook, there's a post that's going to go out in like 5 minutes. That is how to perfect your lunge at home in 5 minutes. It's a video that John made. And it's just super basic. He's doing a whole series called Rapier from the Ground Up. And this is just the first video, but it's a great, it's the first one going out today. And it's a great one to use to get all the basics of the lunge. And it'll come in handy for everything else. And I'll be emailing it after as well.
It's really, really basic stuff. But again, that's what we can practice at home. And it's just going to help you with situating your weight and improving the true times of your actions. Right? At least the first two will, definitely.
Yeah. So that is going live on Facebook at 8:45, and then I will email it out for those of you not on Facebook. And then for those of you who haven't seen, we sent out a schedule for this week for all of the Zoom classes. There's another Rapier class with John at 12:15 on Saturday. And we're pretty much going to do that the rest forever. He'll tell us what's going to be in it whenever he knows what's going on. And it's going to be Mondays, 7:30 to 8:30, and then Saturdays, 12:15 to 1:15. So make sure you check your email for an email from the CSG list that says class links, big capital letters, because that's where all the Zoom links are. And that's how you can get into class. Those will not be posted anywhere publicly. We're not sending out other emails with those links. It's just that one. So make sure you grab that so you can come back to class on Saturday.
And lastly, guys, please do send me, do email me with any suggestions for these classes, because I'm making this shit up as I go along right now. So any help you guys can give me about what you need, what you want. Obviously, you want things you can do by yourselves at home, but specifics that you want to work on that can only help me to refine what I'm giving you. So. So keep it coming, guys, and let's work together, and we'll get through this. Okay. Alicia, am I still the host even though I cut out?
I think
yes,
so.
You are.
Sydney, are you? I was there for a second.
Just checking.
If you look at the participants, you're still the host.
You are.
Okay. Okay, guys. So I'm about to end the meeting. Thank you very much, and I hope to see all of you or some of you Saturday.
Good night.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye.
Click that link, y'all.
Stay
Good
healthy,
night.
stay safe.
You too.
See you
Take
on
care.
Saturday.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Sure.